Hello and welcome to the Manchester is Red podcast. My name is Steven Railston. And just before we jump into this episode, we're going to have a quick word from our sponsors, NordVPN, the fastest VPN in the world and an absolute essential traveling companion. You can use NordVPN on 10 devices with just one account, easily switching your virtual location to access apps and websites in other countries. But if you're out of the country, make sure you've got NordVPN to be able to use your subscriptions and watch the live sport that you might miss. If you're at home, use it to see if you can save money with products that might be cheaper in another region. Go to nordvpn.com/Manchester to get 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. The link is also in the podcast description below. And now that's over and done with. I'm on this episode with Samuel Luckhurst. We were both at United's game on Thursday evening against Southampton in the Premier League. Samuel wanted quite a straightforward evening, quite a simple night. United had the wind in their sails after 2 good results away from home against Liverpool and Arsenal, and it looked like a penalty kick against Southampton. But you always expect the unexpected with Manchester United, and that's exactly what happened. It was an awful performance for most of the game. They looked on course to have an absolute shocking defeat against the league's worst side, but Amad delivered in the final 10 minutes and turned the game on its head. Can you make much sense of that performance and try to do that in this opening bit?
I will try. We wanted a stress-free night, and we got a stressful night. And it would have been great for the United supporters walking out the stadium, floating out the stadium after winning a game like that. But if you're one of the players, you should probably have lost a bit of sleep last night, and not just through the adrenaline. That performance should have kept them up for a little bit longer, because for 80 minutes it was utterly unacceptable. It was humiliating. They were around 10 minutes away from possibly their worst result in the Premier League era. And I mean, Simon Peach, of course, who's a Southampton fan. He's away on his very long honeymoon. I mean, I think Stuart Ratcliffe spends more days in England than Simon Peach does in a year. How often he is off? He's off on holiday in other countries. But he was messaging me a little bit during it, and he predicted that Southampton would collapse. He said they were really mentally flaky, and I said, "Well, look, you've seen United enough this season." And of course, there was that collapse, and United can be indebted to not just Ahmad, not just Southampton's feebleness, but also Joshua Zirkzee and Christian Eriksen. Because the big problem with that performance from United was that they panicked early in the second half, possibly midway through the second half. Most people turned up expecting United to win, and so of course, when they don't go 1-0 up, when they snatch at 2 very good opportunities to go 1-0 up, and then Southampton actually start to cause more problems for United's goalkeeper than United were causing for Aaron Ramsdale up the other end. Anxiety creeps in and people start to feel uneasy. You could hear it in the stands. There was this uneasiness about United's performance, and that filtered through to the players. And when the captain is positionally indisciplined and is running around like a headless chicken with barely half an hour on the clock, United have got a problem. Um, that led to reckless decision making. They were rash. They ended the half with Ahmad reduced to essentially taking a dive to try and win a penalty. As United should have had a penalty earlier, but it was moot. They shouldn't require um, the assistance or the competence, I should say, of the referee to give them a penalty kick against the worst team in the Premier League in 17 years. And Southampton may eventually be remembered as the worst team in the Premier League era. And so it was that first half felt like a new low. It was they were 1-0 down, conceding to a set piece again. That's 10 goals they've conceded from set pieces this season. And really, the strange thing is, as soon as they made it 1-1, I think I don't know about you, but I thought they would win it at that point, because Southampton had managed to hang on for that long. But there's a reason why at kickoff they had 6 points, and they've still got 6 points. They had a minus 32 goal difference as well. And it did, of course, take some quality off the bench to change that game, and that was pretty fitting in that Xerxes and Ericsson obviously operate at a different pace, but it did need that last night. They needed players to actually bring the tempo down to ensure that it wasn't quite as frantic. And of course, Southampton's front three, who were so problematic, they had to make changes there. And Tyler Dibling came off, Suleimanu, I think, came off as well, and he'd had Lenny Yoro spread on his toast that he gorged on all night. And Southampton will probably look back and think that they could easily have gone 2-0 up at one point in that game. But bringing the players on who were patient and were prudent with the ball and just calm things down, it did United the power of good. And it's no coincidence that the first goal, it comes from Xerxes feeding Amad, and the second goal, it's Christian Eriksen conjuring up an ingenious assist.
Scratching my head for most of that game, thinking, where has this come from? But we should have expected it, really. And I thought back to Bruno Fernandes's his quotes after the draw against Liverpool at Anfield, and he was asked about the upcoming games. And he said, I'm actually more worried about Southampton than I am against Arsenal, because he alluded to the players always giving their 100% in these big games on the biggest occasions, but then struggling against sides that are expected to win. And Ruben Amorim discussed that in his press conference before the match as well. This kind of mentality flaw, Samuel, it seemed to have existed for a good few years now, where United can turn up in the biggest games and might get a result against a really top side. And then they come against these sides who are at the bottom of the Premier League at home and they struggle. That's down to mentality, isn't it? Surely.
It is, but 2 seasons ago, I think their record against the bottom half teams was pretty perfect under Eric Ten Hag. The problem was they couldn't win at any of the top half sides. Their away record in those games was dreadful. I think it was between October 2021 and December 2024. They didn't beat any of the other big six, if you want to
But
call them
even
that,
that
still
deteriorated
teams
towards the
away
end
from
of
home.
Ten Hag's time, didn't it? To be obviously, his first season was excellent in that regard, and they were brushing aside those teams. But that started to worsen towards the end of Ten Hag's reign.
Yeah, but they were just crap last season. It wasn't like they were good against big teams and good against small teams. City did the double against them. They did get themselves up for it against Liverpool, but Arsenal did the double against them as well. Tottenham took 4 points off them. Chelsea, who were pretty diabolical for most of last season, beat them, having entered added time at Stamford Bridge, 3-2 down, and they end up winning it 4-3. So United were just they were dire last season. They've been worse this season, and that that any team that goes to Old Trafford, they don't have an inferiority complex. And Southampton didn't need reminding of that. That the past three teams who rocked up at Old Trafford had all won, so they'd have taken confidence from that. And ultimately, that game last night at kickoff, it was between two teams in the bottom six. And I know there's a quite a big points deficit between them, as there are with most teams in Southampton. But Southampton also at St Mary's back in September, they were the better side in the first 30 minutes, and they had a penalty to go 1-0 up, didn't take it, and that's what cost them, because then United exerted a bit of ruthlessness and scored 2 goals within 10 minutes, and that pretty much killed the game. And he's getting quite a lot of name checks in on this podcast, but Simon Peach has been adamant that Southampton are actually quite a good football team. They're just, absolutely, feeble and easily gettable, and they concede a lot of goals. And I wasn't really having it, but they have got some players who I think will have Premier League careers next season. They'll be in the Premier League next season. I mean, Dibbling is the one who springs to mind. He was terrific against United at St Mary's. But still, when you look at that Southampton team last night, you think, well, there are absolutely no excuses here for United. And normally we try to cover all bases and offer a little context or a caveat here and there. But I mean, you were naive last month when you said, "Oh, United should be beating Bournemouth at home," and obviously I had to correct you. And I was,
No,
unfortunately for me,
I
I was
still
proven
believe that
right.
for all of
But
those
last
games. I'll always believe that because of the stature of the club. I know it doesn't work like that anymore. And look at the
it
last
doesn't work.
12
Yeah,
years.
exactly.
I know there's evidence, there's a massive bank of evidence, but I'll still believe it. It might be arrogance that, but they should be beating these sides. It's not that hard if
But,
you're a proper
but
club and you're well run.
but they're not. And last night absolutely was a game where if you'd said they should be winning this, I'd have said, Stephen, you're right, they should be winning this. And they did, but they won it in a way that Amorim was clearly uncomfortable with when he spoke to us afterwards. He said that he'd spoken to Stephen Ratcliffe in the director's lounge, which was why he was a lot later coming in for the press conference, I believe. And he said that the result helped the conversation, but it wasn't a good performance, and it wasn't a good performance. There were about, I mean, it was such a mad game that Amad was really poor until he scored a 12-minute hat trick. That's the sentence that encapsulates the madness of it last night. He was rubbish until he scored a 12-minute hat trick. But he's, at least they've got a gem with him. At least they've got him tied down on a new contract. But Brighton's only a couple of days away already. Brighton are a much more capable and better side than United and Southampton, I should say. And of course, we'll come on to them later on, but that's another game where the majority of United fans will be turning up thinking, is it? Are we going to be seeing another defeat again? That's the mindset they've got. Any team goes to Old Trafford these days and has a chance.
Yep, there's more uncertainty. Amram said after the Anfield game, going back to that, he said it upset him, that performance, because he didn't know where that level of performance had been. So if he was upset after that game, he was definitely going to be upset on Thursday evening. Let's touch a bit more on Amad then. You've just spoken about him there. The game just turned on its head, and like I agree with you, when they scored that equaliser, I did think they'd go on to win it. It felt inevitable. Amad grabbed the ball, he threw his hands up in the air and urged the crowd to get behind the team, and the noise just went up, didn't it, in Old Trafford? And then he just scores a hat trick. The pass from Ericsson for that goal, the second one, was just superb, wasn't it? The little chip over the top, and
Wonderful
Ahmad
pass.
finished brilliantly. Yeah, he's now the team's top goal scorer this season. He's got 9 goals and 7 assists. He was all smiles in the mix zone when I spoke to him after the game. He's just having such an outstanding campaign, isn't he, Samuel? And when you think about the last year and last season, I'm more thinking at the kind of the beginning of last season. He was obviously injured, missed the first 6 months, and then he had a rough time of it. Wasn't really getting a kick. Started to blossom a bit in the spring. And you think back even to the Fenerbahce game recently, and Ten Hag was playing Mazraoui there in a number 10 role over Ahmad. He's had to come through a lot, hasn't he? And he's now looking, well, he is United's best player. He has been this season.
Yeah. I think that he will. That's the Matt Busby statue that's primarily resides in Bruno Fernandes's house in recent years. That will be on display in Ahmad's home come the summer. He's
Alongside
just
his
got
match
better.
ball from the game.
Yeah, yeah, and a couple of man the match awards. So I think he's if he wants to get extension permission, he should probably get in there pretty quickly, because I think he might need it the way he's playing to house all those accolades. But it's becoming difficult to write about him because he's so good. And like, what more can you say about him? That was the first hat trick by a United player last night since Cristiano Ronaldo against Norwich nearly 3 years ago. It's the second. I mean, United's last two wins in the Premier League, they've been courtesy of Amad. I mean, he was responsible for the penalty and the winner against City. He got all 3 goals last night. As you said, he's their top scorer now with 9 goals. But ever since he recovered from that injury, it was a knee injury, wasn't it, against Arsenal in pre-season in 2023. He's just got better and better and better. Starting out with substitute appearances, cameos when United were either drawing or losing, taking his chance when he got that overdue first meaningful start in the Premier League, scoring on a few days later against Newcastle. And I know we're going back to last season, but there was a reasonable debate that he should be starting in the FA Cup final because he'd had such a positive few games after Ten Hag finally actually gave him a chance. And okay, there was that period earlier in the season where he was out in the cold for a little bit and he wasn't starting towards the end of Ten Hag's time at United. But he had a very good pre-season. He was pretty decent at the start of the season, his general play, and he's really benefited from, firstly, having a couple of starts under Ruud van Nistelrooy when he did really well against PAOK and Leicester City. And under Amorim, he's just gone up, not to a new level. I think he's gone up a couple of levels. And the challenge is to keep on going up, keep on rising, and if hopefully, if United's sake, develop into a world-class forward, because on current form he's one of the best players in the Premier League. And it's rare that you say that about a player who's, playing for a team that are stuck in the bottom half of the table. But he's had profound impacts in some extremely big games for United of late, and he's a player that they just cannot do without at the moment, because he scores goals, because he creates goals. He always strives to make something happen. It's a very good knack for a player when they're playing badly and yet they still end up scoring a hat trick. And the manner in which he took all three goals, I mean, even the third goal, he has to anticipate the mistake by Harwood Bellis. He has to do the pressing in the 94th minute to give him the tap in. So there's something laudable about that. The second goal is a really, really good finish. At first I thought it was purely just all about the assist, but it's still a hell of a strike in those 90th minute. There's a hell of a lot of pressure on him there. It's a potential one shot at winning the game. And of course, with the first goal, there's that perseverance where the first shot is blocked with his left foot. So the second shot, he goes with his right foot. There's so much that's endearing about him. And I think we've been banging the drum for him for quite some time, when he was doing pieces about him or stories about him when he was on loan at Sunderland, whereas others, he wasn't even an afterthought. He was just he was an irrelevance. But it's been interesting following his career from the moment I was told that United are quite interested in signing this guy called Amad Traore from Atalanta, who's meant to be good. And then he was Amad Diallo, and then he was just Amad. And last night it was the first time that United fans chanted his name. It was Amad Diallo, wasn't it? It was the Seven Nations Army. I know he's requested that the Diallo be dropped, but I think he'd have made an exception last night, which on what was one of his greatest nights so far with United.
I just had to dig out the game from last year to confirm what I remembered. But if you cast your mind back to the 28th of January, 2024, against Newport County in the FA Cup, United won 4-2, obviously. Amari Forson came onto the pitch that day, and Amad was an unused substitute almost a year later. And look where he is now, and look where Forson is. It was an interesting decision from Ten Hag to really overlook Amad for so long, and it just looks worse, doesn't it, with time?
Yeah.
Let's come on to Joshua Zirkzee. We'll have to give him a really positive mention. We've given Zirkzee some stick on this podcast this season because he hasn't looked up to that level, and he is clearly not a prolific goal scorer. But we've always said his build-up play is fantastic.
Yeah.
He kind of brings his teammates into play, picks the right passes, and he has a cool head. And as you said in your first answer, Samuel, everyone on that pitch in red lost their heads for a moment in that game, didn't it? And when Eriksson came on and when Zirkzee came on, they really started to look a better side. Zirkzee, he really improved United, and he played a big part in the end of that game. Obviously, Amad would take the headlines, but Zirkzee was probably the second best performer on the night by quite far. And he came on from the bench for Rasmus Højlund, who we'll also come on to in a second, because he struggled again.
It was a highly creditable performance, given that his previous performance there ended after 33 minutes with thousands heckling him as he was substituted, and then a few more booing him as he went down the tunnel. I know there were some supporters that also offered him applause that night to try and counter what they felt was an unbecoming reaction. It was certainly unpleasant. I did feel sorry for him. We have to analyse him objectively. It didn't go well for him that night. It wasn't the right team that Amorim picked. I'm not going to waver. I'm not going to suddenly say he's actually an inspired signing. Clearly, United should not have signed him in the summer. They were after a striker to ease the burden on Højlund, and they've not really signed a striker in Zirkzee, as we've discussed before. He is clearly far more comfortable operating in a deeper role, almost as like something in between a number 9 and a number 10.
Well, he said it himself, hasn't he? He says it sounds like woke nonsense, but he's described himself as a 9.5.
You use that so often, don't you? Sean Dyche isn't even a manager at the moment.
You've only heard me say it recently, the last few weeks.
Oh no, I've heard it a lot more than that, I think. But Zirkzee, without him, they would not have won that game last night, because his equanimity was vital in a game where United didn't just lose their heads for a moment. They lost their heads for a long, long time. They were snatching at chances. There was rash decision making. their positioning was poor. They left Lenny Yoro isolated with no cover. They were getting so many things wrong, and they needed someone just to calm it down, change the tempo. And Ericsson, of course, did that. He was about to come on at 1-0 to Southampton. He came on at 1-1. So obviously that does change the dynamic quite drastically, where United are suddenly on the hunt for a winner rather than an equaliser. But you still need that that deftness, that poise, and just that experience, that nous that Ericsson can bring. And again, I'm not going to say, oh, Christian Eriksen should definitely get a new contract in the summer. I don't. I think they should release him. But while you've got him, make the most of him. And he should have come on earlier last night. I tweeted saying that he was pretty much the only valid attacking option to turn to. Of course, Maguire went on with him, and I think we were braced for Maguire going up front as the battering ram. And in the end, he wasn't needed because United did the job thanks to Xerxes, Ericsson, and Amad. But you need different players of different skill sets for different scenarios, and that was a classic case of it last night. And Amorim eventually did read it that way. I mean, I thought Xerxes should have started. Then I thought he should have come on at half time. We didn't have much longer to wait. It was the 53rd minute when he came on, but he made a huge difference because United were struggling to keep the ball. They seemed utterly incapable of constructing attacks in the first half. And Amorim has not even touched upon that. He's spoken about it at length this week in the various press conferences he's had and various sections. And yeah, he's pretty much said that this team was constructed for counterattacks, to score on transitions. And he said that they have players who are effective at that. And he named Rashford and Garnacho, which was potentially telling, given that one wants out and the other one is the subject of pretty intense interest this month. And he, of course, has inherited players who, a lot of them do jar with the system that he wants to play. So he's having to operate via that trial and error and work things out and learn on the job, really. But with Xerxes, as I said, I don't think anybody's pretending that he's all of a sudden the answer to all United's ills, but he's had a pretty remarkable 2.5 weeks since that very public humiliation against Newcastle, and he's shown immense character to come back from it.
He's about to say that he really has, hasn't he? He's shown so much personality to kind of come through that.
He has, and look, he's got a pretty good sounding board in that dressing room if he wants to use him in Maguire, because certainly in my lifetime I can't remember two United players being barracked as much as those two have and obviously they've come in successive seasons as well. But the turning point for Xerxes was when he warmed up at Anfield and United fans were chanting his name, and of course it wasn't a clean enough or a polished pass for Maguire that day. But I maintain he made the right decision in squaring it to Maguire for that potential match-winning moment at Anfield. He did the business at Arsenal. He played well before the penalty shootout. He won the penalty shootout, and he helped them win the game last night as well. And it's easy to forget he actually did quite well when he came on at the Etihad. He literally took the game away from City with his held-up play and carrying the ball into their third in the last knockings of the game. So he's clearly a player with pretty good technical prowess. I think he'd be a pretty good five-a-side player. You could envisage him running the show in five-a-side.
Well, I'd hope
not
so.
necessarily busting a gut to get up front and score goals. He might not score many goals in it, but you could see him certainly dictating play because he's got that proficiency on the ball, and he's got a nice depth of touch and a nice, he's good at deceiving defenders, as you saw with William Saliba at the weekend. And I really hope for his sake that he kicks on from here. I'd love to be proven wrong. As we've said before, there's nothing wrong in our industry with being proven wrong. Certainly with United players, we could do with it happening more often, because if that was the case, there'd be a much more successful side.
My five-a-side claim to fame is that I once nutmegged James Tavernier, who's of course went on to have a very good career with Rangers.
Yeah.
I've probably mentioned that one before,
has,
haven't I? Yeah, probably have.
No, I've not.
Have you not heard that one before? Yeah. Let's end this part by talking about Rasmus Højlund, Samuel. It feels like the elephant in the room. He got the nod to start. I haven't seen the stats yet, I've just come on, obviously, but I should probably dig them out to see how many duels he actually won, because off the top of my head, it feels like he didn't win any the whole night.
Zero.
Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it felt like that, didn't it, watching the game? He was just so poor. He was really struggling to make it stick, and supporters are becoming a bit impatient now because he's really not offering much off the ball.
No.
And if you're not scoring and you're not offering much on the ball, then what are you doing for the team? He did brilliantly, to be fair. There was a moment in the first half to set up Garnacho,
Yeah.
and that was probably the only good thing that he did. He picked out the right pass instead of shooting himself when the angle was
Mm.
tight. Garnacho screwed it wide, and Hoyland lashed out, didn't he? Kicked the post, threw his hands up. He was clearly not happy, but you just feel it's a bit hypocritical, don't you, from Hoyland? When you're reacting like that to a teammate, at least have a really good goal scoring record yourself to be able to lash out like that. He was obviously hooked for Xerxes, replaced, and United improved. Where are we with Hoyland right now? He scored 7 goals this season. He scored 16 last season. I was of the opinion that was a pretty decent first year at the club, considering he was so young
Yeah.
and it was his first season in
I agree.
England, adapting to the Premier League. Yeah, but it doesn't look like he's going to improve on that total, does it? This year, you'd have another, for miscounting there, 9 goals to go. And could you see Hoyland scoring 9 goals from now until the end of the campaign? I probably couldn't.
If he's clutching at a straw, he was the player of the month last year in February. That was the time, of course, when he went on his purple patch. He scored at Wolves. He scored a very good goal against West Ham. There was a decent predatory finish at Aston Villa. He got 2 very well taken goals at Luton, and then he got injured. And you knew at that time it was end of day stuff for United, because they were starting to look pretty good for the top 4, and he was the one injury they could not afford. And of course, the following day they lost 2-1 at home to Fulham. And after that, I mean, Hoyland did. He did pretty much struggle for the rest of the season with the way it was going. And I know he had a couple of goals towards the end of it, but ultimately he was dropped for the running. He was dropped for the FA Cup final, and we've spoken about him chapter and verse in terms of how he was absolutely the wrong profile of striker to sign that summer, and that summer is becoming quite infamous for just how poor the planning was from United, and whether it be the investment in Mason Mount, which is he was just a player I didn't think they should ever have signed, and Hoyland was another player I just didn't think they should ever have signed, and of course they overpaid for both of them. Hoyland was overpriced, and he's also been overpromoted. He's literally the number 9 now, but he doesn't turn 22 until next month, and there are very few strikers at that age. If you're spending big on them, you've got to think, right, he must have a really good goal scoring record. But then you looked at Hoyland's goal scoring record in Denmark, Austria, and Italy combined, and it was mediocre. And so you're inclined to think, well, how's he going to cut it in the Premier League? And he's not cut it. He's got 2 Premier League goals this season. My biggest concern at the moment is that United have just played in back-to-back Premier League games the best team in the Premier League and the worst team in the Premier League, and Hoyland's performance in both of them was identical. And the game in between at Arsenal, he was the weakest player for United on the pitch again that day. You could, I suppose, like put him level with Diallo, given Diallo got sent off. But you go back to his debut when he came on at Arsenal, and he unnerved Gabriel and Saliba. There was that shout for a penalty. There was his role in the disallowed goal. He had a really, really bullish start to his United career coming on in that game and doing as well as he did. Unfortunately, they didn't get the result, but he was definitely a positive that day. And you compare that performance against Arsenal, which would have been about 20 minutes there or thereabouts, to starting against Arsenal the other week, and he doesn't look. He just doesn't look like the same player, and he looks like he's been weighed down by the pressure, by the expectation. That's what you need as a Manchester United striker. You've got to be able to cope with the occupational hazards that the role entails. And Ten Hag told us during that pre-season in San Diego that he was convinced that Hoyland had the character to deal with the stresses of playing for Manchester United. And when he was talking about him at the time, it was one of those things that where none of us had really seen Hoyland play or hadn't really didn't know a great deal about his character. It was, he was saying things that were opening our eyes to him, and we thought, well, maybe they'll be all right with him. And he has got some character, but this season he's gone downhill, and I think this is the third 8-game spell without a goal that he's had at United, which, if you're signing a striker for £64 million, rising to £72 million, you can maybe get away with one of those lean spells every few years, but he's had three of them, one and a half seasons in at the club. And as Amrim has stressed repeatedly this week, this is a squad that has a lack of goals. And the big problem as well that United have, because Amrim has said that it's going to be, he used the word roller coaster for the end of the season, the remaining 4 months. And I agree with him, because this is a capricious United side. They are unpredictable. But also, I mean, this is relevant to Xerxes as well. Against Bournemouth last month, Xerxes lost an aerial duel. Amrim's instant reaction is to turn to Carlos Fernandez and essentially say, go and summon Rasmus. And that's exactly what happened. Xerxes lost an aerial duel. Højlund was summoned. Last night against Southampton, Højlund lost an aerial duel in the 50th or the 51st minute. Amrim turned around to Carlos Fernandez, go and get Joshua. And Xerxes came on. United clearly have a head coach who does not truly believe in either of the two strikers they have signed for more than £100 million in successive summers. That is a big bloody problem for them for the remaining months of the season, because they're going to have to work with those two strikers. They're also going to have to find a potential workaround. Yet they've got three other forwards who could conceivably, they won't all leave this month, but there's a hell of a lot of interest in Garnacho. Rashford wants out. There's chatter about Anthony as well. These are not proven goal scorers either, but they're so light in attack that it's a bit of a disastrous situation that they're in.
Do you think he's too young, Samuel? And I mean, we've talked about it before in that summer when they should have signed a more experienced striker. And I've just checked the Premier League top goal scorers there on my screen. You've got Salah, Haaland, Isaac, Cole Palmer, and Bremo, Chris Wood, Wissa, Matthias Cunha. So obviously, with the exception of Cole Palmer, who's a fantastic football player, everyone on that list is 25 or above, I'd say, mid-20s to late 20s. You've just said yourself, Højlund doesn't turn 22 until the first week of February. And he's at the most scrutinised football club in the world, and he's playing in one of the most important positions as well. Is it not just a case of United have messed up in signing such a young player who is still learning, who is still developing, and we're seeing what should have probably been expected there out on the pitch?
To an extent, yes, but you're always judged on your goal scoring record, and we can't just always refer to his age or refer to his background. If Manchester United have signed you for a fee rising to £72 million, there's got to be a pretty good reason for that, or certainly a few good reasons for it. They must have seen something in him, but it was bad decision making. And I've compared him before to Javier Hernandez, who was around 20 or 21 when he joined United, but he joined a squad that had Rooney, Berbatov, and pretty relevant that he was because he was always injured, Michael Owen. So he could go in there, learn his trade off them, but he hit the ground running. He scored on his debut. He scored a brilliant brace at Stoke City early on that was kind of fueled belief, not fueled belief for him, but fueled belief among United fans that they had found this gem. The other crucial element of the Hernandez deal, of course, he was, similar to Højlund, he was unknown. I'd say in Hernandez's case, he was a complete unknown. When it was announced they'd signed him, I don't think anybody in Europe who didn't work for a football club had ever heard of him. But he only cost £6 million. You fast forward 13 and a half years, and Højlund's costing at least £64 million. And it's the same entry level. Now, United clearly overpaid for him. And I know that Paris Saint-Germain were shopping at the same level, and they put a bid in for him as well, and ended up with Randall Kolo Muani, and he was the other striker that United were looking at. Clearly, neither of them were ideal. The two top options, they just deemed unattainable, Kane and Osman. That was complete nonsense, because Kane, of course, left for Bayern Munich. So that's why I've always said with Højlund, it's not his fault to an extent, because he should never have been signed to become Manchester United starting striker. And the planning was so bad that they were talking about during that pre-season that he wouldn't start every game and that he would swap with Rashford. There was absolutely no mention whatsoever of Anthony Marshall, which is understandable because he took the club for a ride and he seemed to he had his feet up for the majority of last season anyway, didn't he? He didn't play again after the Bournemouth game in early December. And that was a problem for Rashford because having just had his 30-goal season from the left wing, he's told that and he thinks, hang on a minute, why am I going to be playing there? And Rashford only started 2 games there at the start of that season, and it's not an excuse for the way he, for the meagre amount of goals he scored last season, but it certainly it had a bearing on his. It did have a bearing on his form because he thought he was going to be in that role, and then in pre-season he's being played as the striker, and he's being told to prepare to lead the line for the start of the season when he knows and we know that he is not a striker. But Højlund is, unfortunately for him now, he's starting to look really out of his depth. He doesn't want to duel with defenders. I cannot recall a senior United striker who is as hopeless in the air as Højlund. And that is another big problem in the Premier League because it is
He
a really
shouldn't be though,
physical
should he?
league.
'Cause he's built for it when you look at them. He's a big
Yeah,
lad.
he's
He's got
got the
the physique
physique.
for it.
Yeah,
Yeah. He should be all right in
yeah.
duels. Xerxes and Højlund have scored 11 goals between them in all competitions. And just looking at that list, Johan Wissa from Brentford has 11 in the Premier League, which you just smash your head against the wall, don't you, when you look at the numbers, and it just backs up what we're seeing on the pitch. We'll leave it there anyways for part 1, and we'll take a quick break and be back in a moment for part 2. Welcome back to part 2 of the Manchester is Red podcast. We'll finish off our analysis of the Southampton game, as I'm sure you'll be delighted to hear. You might just want to move on from that match, but we'll continue a bit more because United lost the midfield battle. Samuel, I thought, in that game. Kobbie Mainoo was replaced at half-time by Anthony. Manu Ugarte was obviously hooked off as well in the 51st minute. They are developing a relationship and they're starting to look a lot better alongside each other. But this was another regression as a pair, wasn't it?
There was just no control exerted against Southampton, and I was far more disappointed in Mainoo than Ugarte. Mainoo has been, he's certainly since he made his full Premier League debut in November 2023 at Everton.
Yeah.
He's had so many good performances, and he's been brilliant against some excellent sides as well during that time. And Liverpool at home, FA Cup final against City that day at Goodison as well. He was the best player for me. So you expect him to be able to exert control as he's approaching he turns 20 in early April. You expect him to be able to dictate a game against Southampton. He didn't. I mean, he had one of the best opportunities for United at 0-0, and not only didn't he shoot, which I thought was on, but the pullback for Garnacho was well away from Garnacho. There were some kinks to iron out in his game, and Amorim he was asked about, is it difficult preparing, training your team when you don't necessarily know who's going to be staying at the club beyond the current transfer window? And he said that sometimes players hear things and it can affect them, and it's relevant to wonder whether Mainoo has been affected. Where United, I think United have got about it in the wrong way, and that I can understand it to an extent in that this team, where they are, nobody should be deemed untouchable. I get that, but they have practically whipped up interest in two players who were the poster boys in the summer, and it may being one, Garnacho being the other. And it's a pretty drastic shift 6 months, 7 months later to then make it abundantly clear that they're, any academy player, fair game. If the right offer comes in, they'll be sold.
I like to think because he's so laid back that he'd probably be kind of unaffected by all of this going on in the background. he is that kind of personality where he is incredibly mature for his age, and he is. We all know it. He's so laid back, Manu. I like to think it's not having a big impact, but it is a valid point to mention.
But he's not played. How many good games has he had this season? One or
Well, I
two.
think coming into the season, he's obviously
Anfield,
had an injury.
Anfield certainly.
Yeah, he's come into a struggling side. There's been a change of manager, a change of system. Amram was
Yeah,
interesting on
yeah,
him
yeah.
when he spoke in the embargoed section, wasn't he? Because he said he's not as far as long as some of you guys think, meaning you guys referencing journalists. And he said he's still got a lot to work on and develop. He clearly does. He's just not been at his brilliant best this season. But I think it's always difficult when you're such a young player and you're carrying those expectations on your shoulders in a side that is struggling to really show and give the best account of yourself.
Oh, I completely agree with that, and that's what made his form last season so exceptional. He came into a struggling side, so if anything, he's done it before, and of course, a player can get ground down by it, he can get fed up with it, but he has shown that he's capable of performing for a team when they're not performing, or certainly their form book is in a pretty dire state. And as I said, the win last night was United's first outright win in over a month. But he's yeah, what Amram said about him quite recently, as you just touched upon, he's correct in that he has still clearly got a long way to go because he didn't he's not performed this season, and I hope for his sake that it was 8 weeks he was out for, wasn't it, with a hamstring strain. I was hoping that would be a blessing in disguise and that it would allow him to have an overdue rest, having played in the Euros during the summer and had such an intense I mean, it was a pretty intense 7 or 8 month period he'd have had from coming into the United team in November for that game at Goodison, and then forcing his way into the England side during the European Championship and starting in the final there. But and of course, there's been a managerial change at United as well. But a lot has gone against him in that he's not had the form, he's not had a consistent partner, even though he'll have known during the summer that United were signing Manuel Ugarte to partner him, whether it was going to be whatever formation it was going to be, it was going to be those two ideally at some point down the line. And he's still, there's still peaks and troughs there. Whereas last season it just seemed to be peak after peak after peak with Mainu. So I sincerely hope he gets back to that level because he's a hell of a player and he's a wonderful player to watch when he's on song, but he's not been singing the best of tunes recently.
From one 19-year-old to another, then, and I guess it's important to stress, me again, 19 years old, and I'm about to discuss Lenny Yoro, 19 years old. He was had toast, wasn't he? As you put it, he had a difficult night up against some pacey and tricky wingers who were kind of just attacking him in those wide areas. He was getting dragged out, and the ball was getting flicked past him. But having said that, Samuel, is it not? I think you made the point. It's a rite of passage. I think you said for United players, young United players, to go through something like that. And Yoro was always going to have these moments this season because he's in a new country, yada yada yada, learning to adapt, and that was a bit of a lesson for him last night, wasn't
Almost every newly signed or recently signed United centre back has a bit of a nightmare, and that trend was bucked by, of all people, Eric Bailly in 2016. He had such a good start for United, getting the man the match on his debut in the Community Shield, and then he got the Player of the Month in his first month at the club. Harry Maguire had a pretty steady start as well. In fairness, it will have helped that he was Premier League ready as well. But even Lisandro Martinez, of course, he got going quite quickly and he had a really really good first season, but we remember Brighton, we remember Brentford. Those were his first two games for the club. So it is a rite of passage. It's something that nobody should be worried about. He had I mean, Yoro had a torturous night. Yeah, he of the players who would have lost sleep over that game, I think he might be. He might still be awake as we speak at this moment. It was not a good night for him whatsoever, but he's just got to move on from it. And people at the club have got to tell him, Yap Stam getting the chasing from Nicola Anelka in the Charity Shield in '98 and at Highbury early on in that season in the treble, Gary Pallister being involved in the 5-1 at Main Road early on in his United career in 1989. It has happened to the best of them. Rio Ferdinand did not have a good start to his United career. He was injury prone in his first few months after he moved there from Leeds in 2002. Nemanja Vidic did not have a good start. He was very, very shaky. I particularly remember when they lost at Ewood Park in the league. It might have been his first Premier League start, in fact, in January or February 2006. And I've just mentioned there 4 or 5 of the best centre backs in United history. So I don't think he should worry. I mean, not even I don't think he just should not worry about what happened last night. He should worry about it if it happens a second time or a third time in the coming weeks. But yeah, Amrim also, in fairness to him, he tried to ease ease the attention on him, ease the scrutiny on him by saying like the way they were set up didn't really help him. That they left him 1 against 1, and that he was where Amad, I think, was playing on the wing and is such an attack-minded player because he is an attacker. That possibly left Euro more isolated. And it was also quite innovative what Southampton did, in that they didn't play with a striker. They had 3 forwards. They were pretty fluid. And it was almost as if those 3 forwards were pitted against United's back 3. And they penned United in quite often and made it very uncomfortable for them.
Ahmad made us laugh in the mix on when I asked him which position he prefers, right wing back or right wing, and he replied, "I prefer both." I'm not sure it works like that, Ahmad, but thanks for the quote anyways. Moving on then, there's a game on Sunday against Brighton, 2 p.m. at Old Trafford. As you just said before, Brighton are a very good side. They're decent, obviously better than Southampton, who are bottom of the league, and United must play much better.
They should, yeah. Well, that's the tricky thing. Any game for any team going to Old Trafford is winnable, and Brighton have turned over United a couple of times in recent years. They've won their past 2 trips to Old Trafford. Going into that game in September last season, most people expected Brighton to win because of the state United were in at the time, and Brighton did win. They won 3-1, and the scoreline flattered United that day. Brighton went 3-0 up at one point, and then 3-0 up, and then they just pretty much took their foot off the gas when they could have really rubbed United's noses in it. So it'll be fascinating to see how Brighton fare. It's the third, I think. Obviously, last season De Zerbi was in charge. The season before that, Potter was in charge. It would have been one of his last games as Brighton manager, and they've got a different manager in charge this season. But they have a very consistent way of playing. They're very identifiable. They've got some terrific players there, and you look at the team they picked last night. I think there were certain selections made for their win at Ipswich that had United on the mind. On Sunday, Danny Welbeck was on the bench at Portman Road. You'd expect him to start at Old Trafford. He's had I know he got injured recently, but he's been excellent this season whenever I've watched him, and I think he was certainly warming up for a potential England recall at one point, and you wouldn't rule it out. He's doing so well at Brighton, but they've got quality and depth as well. You look at Brighton's bench last night and the players they had at their disposal to bring on should they have needed to, and it's just a squad that is brimming with quality. I think they had a Dingra starting. They had Minter on the bench. They've got some really, really good players, and as I said earlier, I don't think too many United fans will be turning up on Sunday expectant of a victory, put it that way.
I imagine Diego Dallo comes back into the team and Mazraoui moves back to the other side, and Ahmad probably starts in one of the number 10 roles again. I don't think there's much more to add really on the game, but we will end on your story today,
Transfers.
Samuel. Yep, a bit of transfer housekeeping at the end of the podcast. Napoli have had a bid rejected for Alejandro Garnacho with around £40 million. That's quite a lot of money, but probably not enough for a player of his talent. But he is considered as obviously an academy player, although he joined from Atletico Madrid. And as we have mentioned in the last few weeks, United are open to those sales because they are incredibly helpful to operate within the PSR rules.
And I don't agree with that. I don't think you agree with that.
Yeah, it's a load of rubbish, isn't it? It's anti-football, the rules.
I possibly would go as far as that. It's as we've discussed recently, there's nothing wrong with using your academy as a cash cow, and United have not milked it enough, or they've struggled to even get it into a place where they could milk it. Unlike City City with their academy, or Chelsea with their academy. I mean, some of the fees that they've received for players that you've barely heard of have been pretty mind blowing. I think James Trafford went for roughly the same fee to Burnley as Dean Henderson went to Crystal Palace. And James Trafford, when he signed for Burnley, had been playing in League One for Bolton. That's just it boggles the mind in one sense, but also it just absolutely shows how dreadful United have been for years at selling players, and also developing certain academy players into sellable assets. Because Dean Henderson, they could have been the problem they had there was that they had a manager who's indecisive and is about to rock up at Besiktas. If they had someone who was decisive, they could have got big money for him. Chelsea had a £40 million bid rejected for him one summer. Nottingham Forest were looking to sign him for £30 million. In the end, United got 15 million up front for him because they dillied and dallied, and there was indecision after indecision. And in the end, it gets to the point where they just have to sell him and just take whatever's reasonably okay on the table from a prospective buyer. But where the goalposts have changed now, you've got, as I said earlier, two of the poster boys of last season, or the two poster boys last season, because Højlund was hanging off their coattails, Garnacho and Mainu. They are now both effectively for sale. If a team offers £70 million for Garnacho or £70 million for Mainu, United would accept it, because they need to raise funds. They need that profit to be reflected for the financial figures. Obviously, it came out this week that none of the Premier League clubs were in breach of PSR for the period between 2021 and 2024, but United are still having to balance those books, because you look at the finances between the period of starting from 2022 and coming up to the present. There will be some fundamental issues there. I mean, 2022, you think of how much money they spent eventually, or committed to investing in that summer, when Casemiro and Antony were signed quite late on the transfer window. And I mean, what they got money that summer, I think, for two players, James Garner and Andreas Pereira, who, it's not a coincidence, two academy players, two homegrown players. And they didn't get a great deal in the following summer, but I think the highest sales, possibly, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, probably Anthony Elanga and Dean Henderson, again, two academy players. Last summer, Mason Greenwood, they got a reasonable fee for him, all things considered. Scott McTominay, they got something like, what was it, £25 million in the end, or there or thereabouts. So there is a clear theme here, and they see the potential in it, and it's got to the point now where they think, you know what, if we get a big fee for one of these two players, we can sell it. We can sell them, and we can sell it to supporters. Why it's a good thing, because I think that is going to be the other thing they have to.
I mean, that's the impossible task. If you're trying to convince supporters that selling Kobbie Mainoo is a good thing, it's just not going to happen, is it? It's like
struggle. They will struggle.
The party wants you to ignore all the evidence in your eyes.
Yeah. And look, United have been quite Orwellian at times in recent years, but they will say, well, look, the manager has had him in and out of the team. I mean, this is if Mainu was to be sold this month. I still think that's a really long shot, given his valuation and the length on his contract. But there is a way where they could, fans might not like it, they might not swallow it, but they can try and frame it as why we had to do this and why we think it's in the interests of Manchester United. But then you have to go out and sign someone who is going to be able to play football as well as Kobbie Mainoo did in the FA Cup final last season, or against Liverpool in the FA Cup quarter-final last season, or on his debut at Goodison Park, at Molineux. And I know I'm harking back to his form primarily last season, but look how well he played at Anfield recently. And also, he is a kid who has grown up in Greater Manchester as a United fan, and you cannot underestimate that, because there is a definite attachment there. And we saw that when Marcus Rashford came into the team in 2016, just how exuberant he was, how much he buzzed off playing for his boyhood club. And that's why it's such a pity that it's gone the way it has with him, and the fact that he's not started, or he's not played in any of the past 8 games, because it is different with an academy player. Um, but also you've got to look at the finances of it. I mean, Gary Neville touched upon it recently regarding Mohamed Salah. I know he's after, what, 400 grand a week, but if Liverpool let him go, they will have to sign someone for 60 million pounds. That player will have to be put on 200 grand a week minimum, something like that, because of their valuation. And all of a sudden, you're investing more money in a player who is probably not as good as Mohamed Salah, and there's a very good chance that he will not have the same impact as him. Just after Mohamed Salah has probably scored the goals that have taken Liverpool to their 20th title.
And see if United somehow did sell Manu for £70 million, which I think is an unlikely outcome. I think he will sign that deal. Our supporters going to trust a football club that is just regularly every summer got their recruitment massively wrong to bring in a better player with that money. No, absolutely not, as you've just said. Anything else to add on the transfer
I
front,
think,
Samuel? Because, sorry, go on.
I suppose with Garnacho, that is an easier one to frame as, like, we had to do this, in that, as I've said on, I think, some of the podcasts recently, he's been developed as a winger, and he's played as a winger in the first team. And now United are operating in a system where they have fullbacks on the wings, and he's having to play infield. Most other teams, Napoli, for instance, he would go in on their left wing. That would be his role, and that's clearly where he's at his most comfortable. But so there would be some logic there if they're getting, big money to sell him, as unpalatable as it may be for some United supporters. But he's not proactive. He's not proactively looking for a move either. He's quite happy at United. So that's where the club are caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place, in that, no, they shouldn't be deeming any player. They shouldn't be deeming one or two players untouchable or not for sale. I completely understand that, but they seem to be whipping up, whether it's intentional or unintentional. They seem to have whipped up more interest in some of their best players, certainly talent wise, anyway, in Manu and Garnacho.
Amram said at the start of the month that United would look to do something in this window, but it is starting to feel like there has to be movement regarding outgoings for that to happen, doesn't it? I mean, we're on the 17th of January now. There's not much left in the window, halfway through. And Marcus Rashford's obviously the big one if they can arrange an exit from him. But it does feel like, again, that'll probably be a loan deal with a European club instead of a permanent transfer, which would be ideal for everyone involved, really.
I think there's every chance that this time next week, when we're talking, nobody will have left, nobody will have come in, and I suspect there'll be a good chance of that being the case 2 weeks from now. And then come that Monday, and I, I, I really hate the football lawmakers for extending the January/February transfer window to February the 3rd. I mean, work that out. Why the hell has it been extended 3 days into February? And then come that Monday, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of movement and that there are comings and goings at United, because that is the way it often works. You feel it out. You feel clubs out, agents out, what have you. And when push comes to shove, someone has to blink, and then there's the domino effect. I know I'm mixing quite a few metaphors there, but that's kind of like the way it's going. And there are some clubs who are being a bit more opportunistic this month, because with PSR, the financial year ends on June 30th, so that's only a small fraction of the summer transfer window, which of course is open for all of July and August. So that's why I think the January transfer window is club. It feels a little bit more feverish this year than it has in previous years, and it's just strange, really, that United have got a player there who wants out, and it feels like they're not expending enough or dedicating enough resources to ensuring that he goes. Yet it's a player who was deemed not for sale 6 or 7 months ago, who suddenly there was a hell of a lot of noise around, and is the player who has been the subject of a bid from Napoli. So it's not great. It's pretty, it's pretty unstable. And I feel for Amarim, because he could do with stability, but he can't know for certain which players are going to be with him come the end of the winter transfer window. But it is absolutely imperative that United don't end it with a weaker squad than they started it, and that would be the big reservation with Garnacho if they were to sell him. Would you trust them to get a player in who would be better than him, and who you would look at and you would say, yes, United are a stronger squad with Garnacho gone and this player in. It's a tall order for United to do that in the winter window if it should come to it.
Yeah, very well said. We'll leave it there then, Samuel. Thanks for your time as usual.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you.
And thanks to the listeners. As always, we'll be back on Monday to reflect on the game against Brighton. Enjoy your weekend and take care.